There's a moment that happens with Gemini that most people don't notice. It's the moment when everything seems fine on the surface, the conversation is flowing, the energy is playful, the connection feels alive, but underneath, something is already preparing to leave. Not physically, not dramatically, mentally. Have you ever wondered why Gemini can be fully present and already halfway gone at the same time? Why the same person who pulls you in with curiosity, attention, and intensity suddenly feels unreachable, without warning, without explanation? Here's the question most people never ask. If Gemini truly didn't care, why do they feel restless even when nothing is wrong? Why does staying still feel more uncomfortable than walking away? And why does being fully understood feel more threatening than being misunderstood? If you're a Gemini or if you've ever loved one, pause here, because what you're about to hear isn't flattering. It isn't comforting, but it might be the first explanation that actually makes sense. And if this resonates uncomfortably deeply, don't scroll away. Stay. Because Gemini's real pattern doesn't reveal itself to people who leave too quickly. Gemini isn't dangerous because they change. Gemini is dangerous because they refuse to stay long enough to become something they can't escape from, and that includes versions of themselves. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, the planet of thought, communication, speed, movement, and mental agility. This isn't just astrology, poetry. It explains everything. A Gemini mind doesn't move in a straight line. It branches, it overlaps, it contradicts itself in real time. Every feeling is immediately questioned. Every belief is challenged by an alternative perspective. Every emotional experience comes with commentary, analysis, and a possible exit strategy. Gemini doesn't live inside one truth. They live inside a continuous internal dialogue. And that dialogue never truly shuts off. Most people experience emotions first, then think about them later. Gemini does both simultaneously. While something is happening, they are already interpreting it, reframing it, joking about it, distancing from it, or imagining what it means 5 steps ahead. This mental speed is a gift, but it's also exhausting. The dark side of Gemini doesn't begin with dishonesty or inconsistency. It begins with one core fear that almost no one talks about: the fear of psychological entrapment. Not controlled by another person, Gemini can usually handle that, but the fear of being frozen inside one identity, one role, one emotional reality, one version of themselves that becomes permanent. Gemini doesn't fear depth, they fear permanence, because permanence feels like suffocation. When Gemini commits to something, a relationship, a belief, a lifestyle, even a self-image, it doesn't just feel like a choice. It feels like closing doors they might need later, like locking themselves into a room when there are still hallways left unexplored. So they keep options open, they keep moving, they keep evolving. From the outside, this looks like instability, indecision, or emotional inconsistency. But internally, it feels like survival. Gemini learns early that their mind is their escape route. When emotions become heavy, they intellectualize them. When situations get intense, they talk their way around them. When pain shows up, they analyze it instead of letting it land. Words become armor. Humor becomes deflection. Curiosity becomes distraction. They don't avoid depth, they skim across it so they don't drown. This is why Gemini can talk about anything but struggle to stay with one thing. Why they can create instant mental intimacy but hesitate when that intimacy turns into expectation. Why they seem emotionally present one moment, then distant the next, not because something changed externally, but because internally an alarm went off. The moment something starts defining Gemini too tightly, they feel cornered. In relationships, Gemini is magnetic at the beginning. They listen. They ask questions others never think to ask. They mirror your thoughts, your humor, your inner world. They make you feel intellectually alive, understood, expanded. With Gemini, conversations feel like discovery. You feel seen, not just emotionally, but mentally. And for many people, that's intoxicating. But here's what no one warns you about. When the relationship begins to settle, when novelty fades, when emotional consistency is required, When the connection asks for depth without stimulation, something inside Gemini tightens. Because depth eventually demands stillness. It asks you to stay even when there's nothing new to discover. It asks you to show up without performance. It asks you to be predictable in some ways. And that's where Gemini begins to panic. Not because they don't care, but because staying means being witnessed across time. Being known not just for your thoughts, but for your patterns, your cycles, your contradictions that don't disappear. Gemini fears being reduced to something predictable. So they pull back, they change tone, they introduce distance, they distract themselves, they convince themselves they're bored. Sometimes they don't leave physically, they just stop fully arriving. They're still texting, still talking, still joking. But something essential is missing. They tell themselves they're protecting their freedom, but the truth is more uncomfortable. They're protecting their ability to reinvent themselves at will. Freedom, for Gemini, isn't just about independence from others. It's about independence from their own past selves. The tragedy is that Gemini wants to be deeply understood, but they also fear that if someone truly understands them, they'll expect consistency. So Gemini often chooses to be partially known rather than fully held. Over time, this creates a quiet loneliness. Gemini is rarely alone, but often feels unseen, surrounded by conversations, connections, opportunities, stimulation. Yet, lacking an anchor, they begin to feel like an observer in their own life, narrating experiences instead of fully inhabiting them, talking about emotions instead of staying inside them, explaining themselves instead of allowing themselves to be experienced. The darkest part isn't that Gemini leaves. It's that they don't always know who they are staying for. When your identity keeps shifting, commitment can feel like betrayal, not of others, but of future versions of yourself you haven't met yet. How do you promise permanence when you don't trust yourself to stay the same? This is where Gemini's shadow becomes self-sabotage. They leave before being left. They detach before being defined. They move before being rooted. And then they wonder why nothing ever feels solid. Healing for Gemini doesn't come from slowing their mind or dulling their intelligence. It comes from learning to stay emotionally present even when the urge to escape appears. From recognizing that discomfort isn't danger. That stillness isn't a trap. That depth doesn't erase freedom, it refines it. A healed Gemini still evolves, still questions, still explores, still changes, but they stop using movement as avoidance. They learn to sit with discomfort without narrating it away. They learn that being seen consistently doesn't mean being reduced. That allowing someone to know them across time doesn't erase possibility, it gives it meaning. Gemini's true power was never their ability to change. It was their ability to integrate, to hold multiple truths without running from all of them, to let identity be fluid without being empty. And when Gemini finally stops running from being defined by something meaningful, they realize something profound. They were never trapped. They were afraid of being seen.